Your Excellency, Mr. Tharman, the African Development Bank Board of Directors, African Development Bank Senior Management, representatives of diplomatic missions in Côte d'Ivoire, gentlemen and ladies of the press, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third Kofi A. Annan Eminent Speakers Lecture Series, holding here at the Babaka India Auditorium. Here are the headquarters of the African Development Bank, courtesy of the African Development Institute. To those joining us from our respective regions and country offices and through our streaming services, again we say welcome to you and good morning. My name is Victor Oladukunna, and I'm the Director of Communication and External Relations at the African Development Bank. And as always, it really is a great pleasure being the moderator of this event. Just by way of background, our very first eminent speaker lecture, named after an illustrious African son, the former UN Secretary General Kofi A. Annan, was Her Excellency Madame Gracia Machel, one of the greatest names in contemporary African history, who spoke on the theme, Educating the Girl Child, Empowering Women, and Enhancing Female Entrepreneurship in Africa. Our second eminent speaker was the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize co-laureate, Madame Lema Roberta Gbowie, whose lecture was titled Grassroots Women Activists, The Underrated Power. While today we're honored to have an equally and eminently distinguished global leader who will be formally introduced shortly by President Adesina. But before we begin, we'd like to present a very short clip on what the bank is doing in the field of industrialization, which again, as you all know, is one of our high fives. Not only are we pushing the envelope, creating transformative changes across the continent in this particular area, in the process we continue to impact the lives of ordinary people each and every day in the millions. We'll go to our video presentation right now, and then we'll come back in just a few moments. If we could kindly roll tape, that'd be wonderful.
Comment on a dit à l'oufou maintenant bienvenue dans la 24 ans. Tant on est sur la mouki na aux abysses et puis quoi musala na cimenterie nyumba ya kibasinko.
Commissioned in 2015, this ultra-modern cement factory funded by the African Development Bank is one of Africa.
Sato sala ya komema libanga iko nyonso ti kokomisa ngo na bon pendant na komi 5 awa ya da inane na ndambo nasala ba formation ebele ti lelo na komi na niveau ya bimisa ba carottage en plus nazwi pe formation ba bangement mingi na eliki ya ete ke ba formation e continue mingi ka mpona ngai pour ke lobi na komasi na niveau ya toucher salaire bien. Si nous avons chaque fin à mois, et si nous avons un ami, parce que normalement même indépendant, c'est dépendant sous la famille. Et si nous avons un ami, nous avons soutenir les études universitaires à grande sœur propre, parce que papa Tikalate, papa Koufa. Donc, nous avons un numba, et si nous avons ma casse, nous sommes libres. Ici, il y a un comité en 3 ans passé. Nous avons un chômeur. En plus, Kobi Kapso qui passe. Communauté, famille, et puis, Batounion, c'est ça qui passe. Ça qui n'a pas de difficulté aussi, on peut nous sommes à aussi là. Juste ça.
The cement plant is changing the daily lives of thousands of people, from From extraction to processing, this industry is responding to a growing demand for housing and infrastructure and literally helping to rebuild the country.
Le ciment, c'est un matériau de construction et il est très utile, très important dans la vie des gens. On dit après l'eau, l'homme consomme le ciment. Pour nous, il était quand même essentiel de ne pas seulement s'occuper du profit. Mais en venant installer un grand projet ici, les soucis étaient d'abord d'industrialiser la contrée, d'augmenter le niveau de vie de la population locale dans le strict respect de l'environnement.
It's because of these ambitions that the African Development Bank helped fund the construction of the Inyumbaya Akiba cement plant with a $60 million loan.
Donc notre politique dans cette société, c'est d'employer et au mieux de former la communauté locale, de les faire participer dans notre projet et par ça nous augmentons leur pouvoir d'achat et indirectement c'est la région qui bénéficie de notre projet. Mais on a envie d'aller plus loin. Nous accompagnons des ONG qui ont des projets de développement localement. Nous finançons des infrastructures de base, les marchés, l'hôpital, l'accès à l'eau potable et une école primaire.
On n'est pas magistrat, on n'est pas enseignant, mais on le devient, n'est-ce pas? Voilà, merci.
L'éducation, c'est la clé pour l'avenir de ces enfants. Depuis l'inauguration de l'école, le mois de septembre passé, nous sommes passés de 50 élèves à 300 élèves. C'est un grand joie pour nous. Quand la cimenterie s'est installée, ils ont financé la rénovation de cette école. Avant, l'école était complètement délabrée. Nous manquions de toits, de fenêtres, de portes, de bancs, de pupitres. Et vraiment, nous manquions de tout pour bien éduquer les enfants. Si bien que l'école était très peu fréquentée, c'était vraiment malheureux, fort regrettable. Aujourd'hui, les enfants travaillent dans de très bonnes conditions. Désormais, ils n'ont plus de chances de réussir dans la vie future. C'est très bien comme ça, c'est des bonheurs. Cette génération va permettre le développement de notre contrée et le développement du pays.
Il y a une nouvelle génération qui arrive et je crois une nouvelle mentalité aussi des jeunes Africains. Nos papas, nos grands-pères, eux pensaient autrement. Ils pensaient que l'avenir était en dehors de l'Afrique, mais nous pensons que l'avenir c'est en Afrique.
Building on decades of experience, Africa's most trusted development partner, the African Development Bank, is committed to the continent's accelerated industrial growth, the creation of job opportunities, and sustainable development. Through capacity building, skills development, and funding, the bank is reinventing Africa, improving the quality of life of millions of Africans and enabling them to become builders of their own destiny.
I think for many of us here at the African Development Bank, one of the exciting things about working here is that you get to see on a regular basis the impact of our work across the continent. It's not just about industries, it's not just about what we do in energy and all of the other high fives. It really is about the difference that we make each and every day in the lives of individuals. That for me, and for many of us here, is why we lace up our shoes each and every morning and why we come in excited to help make a difference. Once again, you are welcome to this eminent speaker series. And I'd like to call on President Akiomi Adesina, the President of the African Development Bank, this morning to provide his welcome remarks and to introduce our distinguished eminent speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, kindly give a warm welcome to President Akiomi Adesina.
Vos Excellences, honorables ministres, Excellences, Messieurs et Mesdames, les ambassadeurs, les doyens de la Conseil d'administration de la Banque africaine de développement, le Dr. Brad Okogu, les membres du conseil d'administration de la Banque africaine de développement, le vice-président principal de la banque, M. Boama, membre de la haute direction de la Banque africaine de développement, Monsieur le vice-président par intérim et économiste principal, économiste en chef de la banque, Monsieur Charles Fumpa, et Kevin Rama, le directeur qui s'occupe de l'Institut de développement africain. Good morning, everybody. It gives me such great pleasure to welcome you all to the 23rd Eminent Speakers Lecture Series of the African Development Bank. A special welcome to our special guest and eminent speaker, the Honorable Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam. I hope I got that right. Good. Singapore's Coordinating Minister for Social Policies. He's joined by an impressive high-level delegation here today, which includes his lovely spouse. I understand your wife is joining you here, Madam Jane Yumiko Itogo. As well as Dr. Tan Wu Meng, Senior Parliamentary Secretary and the Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Trade and Industry, Mr. Heng Ang Yu, Director General for South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and senior officials of Enterprise Singapore, including Ms. Kathy Lai, Deputy Chief Executive Officer of Enterprise Singapore. Thank you, Honorable Minister Shanmugaratnam, for taking time out of your very busy schedule to travel all the way from Southeast Asia to speak to us today. The African Development Bank launched the Eminent Speakers Lecture Series a couple of years ago. The lecture series has attracted a wide range of speakers, as Dr. Oladokun was saying, recognized among the world's most influential thinkers. This premier dialogue event provides a platform for a robust exchange of ideas for Africa's development. Last year, we hosted 4 speakers, including Nobel Prize winner, Peace Prize winner from Liberia, Lyman Bowe, Mozambican politician and peace activist, Gracia Machel, Nigeria's Emir Sanusi Lamido II, and Tunisia's businesswoman, Ouded Bouchamaoui. We dedicated our Eminent Speaker Lecture Series to the late Kofi Annan, former United Nations Secretary General. Kofi Annan was a man of immense stature, Africa's global thought leader, who was United Nations Secretary General, and as United Nations Secretary General, he launched the Millennium Development Goals. Mr. Annan once said, without a dream, you don't get anywhere. Well, it is that dream for Africa's accelerated development that drives us right here at the African Development Bank. A dream well encapsulated by Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. That Africa we want is one where there is rapid and inclusive economic growth with high quality of life for all Africans. And it is all so similar to the dream of the small nation of Singapore at its independence in 1965. Struggling with poverty and weak human capital and lacking any natural resources of any kind, this tiny island nation has grown to become one of the world's most developed countries. Singapore's first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, took this tiny island nation to the pinnacle of fast economic growth and quality development. From a GDP per capita of only $428 in December of 1960, it powered itself to GDP per capita of $64,567 by December of last year, an expansion of 150 times. I think they deserve an applause for that. When you think of Singapore, think of the following things that describes the economy. The lowest infant mortality in the world. The highest life expectancy in the world. At 84.8 years, if you want to live long, I think you should go live in Singapore. The sixth most healthy nation globally, according to the World Health Organization. 90% of its population, they own their own homes. Is the third least corrupt nation in the world. The second most open nation globally. The second most pro-business country in the world doing business released by the World Bank. And the only country in Asia, all of Asia, with a AAA rating from all global rating agencies. And as you can see, he came with quite a big delegation with him. I can tell you, Singapore is the only country in the world that its passport gets its citizens everywhere. In all 187 countries, they don't need visas, or they can get it immediately on arrival. So you can come with a whole delegation like this place, and they will get their visas immediately. Incredible. And speaking of AAA, welcome to the African Development Bank, Africa's only AAA-rated financial institution by all 4 global rating agencies. And you've come, Mr. Minister, at a great time. For just last week, Thursday, the Board of Governors of the African Development Bank approved a 125% general capital increase for the bank, raising the bank's capital by $115 billion. Rising from $93 billion to $208 billion, the highest capital increase in the history of the bank since 1964. This positions the bank to be much stronger financially, to be able to do more for Africa. And I do hope, Honorable Minister, that the AAA Singapore will join the AAA African Development Bank. And just so that we can help move that along, just for your information, my initials are also AAA, so we can help. As we continue our efforts to do more, we want to learn from the impressive achievements of Singapore. And no one is better placed to discuss this and all of the things around Asia and Africa with us than Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam is currently Senior Minister and Coordinating Minister for Policies for Social Policies of Singapore. He is a global leader with an impressive career and accomplishments. He was Minister of Finance from 2007 to 2015. He was Minister of Education from 2003 to 2008. He was Minister of Manpower from 2011 to 2012. He is the chair of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which regulates the central bank and all the financial sector. He served as Singapore's Deputy Prime Minister for 8 years. On the global level, he co-chairs the Advisory Board of the United Nations 2019 Human Development Report, and is a member of the Board of Trustees of the World Economic Forum. He chaired the International Monetary and Financial Committee of the International Monetary Fund, IMF. And I can go on. His wealth of knowledge is so deep and quite expansive. He recently chaired the G20 Eminent Persons Group on Global Financial Governance, focused on how multilateral financial institutions should work to improve global financial governance, financial stability, and coordination. I met Minister Tharman during this time, and I was chairing the presidents of all the multilateral finance institutions globally. And I must say, I have been so highly impressed. The G20 Eminent Persons Committee that he chairs so ably called for better coordination by the multilateral development banks in country platforms, regional platforms, and that efforts focus on leveraging global institutional investors. Their report praised the African Investment Forum, which the bank is spearheading, and which last year helped to secure investment interest of $38.7 billion to Africa in less than 72 hours. The 2019 forum will hold 11 to 13 November, for which I hope Singaporean firms will also participate. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our speaker for today, Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam, holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the London School of Economics, a Master of Arts degree from Wolfson College of the University of Cambridge, and a Master's in Public Administration from Harvard University. Please join me to warmly welcome a distinguished economist, a global leader in finance, a highly accomplished senior minister from Singapore, our guest speaker, Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam, for his lecture titled Inclusive Growth, Learning from Experience, Partnering for the Future, How Africa and Asia Can Work Together for Broad-Based Prosperity. Honorable Minister, welcome.
President Akinwumi Adesina, your board members and senior management, excellencies, and everyone who's here. First, I'd really like to thank Dr. Adesina for inviting me and giving me this privilege of delivering this latest Kofi Annan Eminent Speakers Series lecture. It's a privilege for me, first because of who Kofi Annan was. He was a patriot of his own country, Ghana. He was a global thought leader and statesman, and he represented something that was the best of humanity. He brought a spirit of humanity into global organizations and global thinking. And I'm also privileged to be here because I do regard President Adesina and what you've done with the African Development Bank as pioneering not just in Africa, but pioneering in global finance. And I'll mention some aspects of this pioneering role that you've been charting later in my speech. So thank you very much. It's a true privilege for me to be here. As you say, it was not a short journey, but the value that comes from this journey vastly exceeds the minor inconveniences that it entailed. We are at a very unusual time globally, I must say, a time of unusual challenge where some of the basic beliefs of how the world prospers together are being challenged, but it's also a time of immense opportunity that still remains there in the international economy, in international finance, and international cooperation. We know what the tensions are in trade, in investment, in global supply chains, in technology. And it is I would say, a perilous moment in the global community because we are at risk of going backwards. We know what the tensions are within societies, and if you look at what's happening from Santiago to Beirut and a whole set of global cities, they are not merely political disruptions, not merely different forms of political unrest. They do reflect more deep-seated divisions within societies, and in particular, the failure of growth to be inclusive. And addressing these internal tensions and divisions must equally be a priority for the future, wherever we are in the world. But it's also a time of unusual opportunity. First and foremost, the opportunity of enabling the developing world, the developing and emerging world, to converge on standards of living that have been achieved in the advanced world is an immense opportunity. Young populations, starting from lower levels of productivity, being able to move up from poor to low middle income to upper middle income. It's an immense opportunity not just for the nations concerned, but for the global community. And there is also great opportunity for greater connectivity and economic interaction and people-to-people interaction between developing regions. And one of the aspects that I'll touch on in my speech is the need for greater connectivity and interaction between ASEAN and Africa. And there's also tremendous opportunity in the developing world to build more inclusive societies, which by and large we do not yet have. So the challenges are also opportunities. There is a lot more to be done, and it can be done with the right policy orientations, with the right collaborative networks, and with a single-minded focus on getting things done as effectively as possible. Africa itself exemplifies these challenges and opportunities. In fact, I would say in the next decade, the challenges and opportunities facing Africa are much larger than in anywhere else in the world, and what happens in Africa will shape the destiny of the global community. Put simply, the arc of history, how the arc of history bends, will depend on whether we succeed in Africa. The demographics is quite clear. In 15 years' time, Africa will have the largest working age population in the world, larger than China, larger than India. 1.1 billion people of working age population, in other words, age 15 to 64. It will also be the most youthful population, the largest youthful population in the world, which must be an asset in a world that is gradually aging. And it will be a region which has now the potential to catch up in levels of productivity and therefore wages with the advanced world. Levels of productivity in Africa on average are still only about 11 to 12% of the level in the United States. That's in PPP terms. It's about half that level when you use market exchange rates. So tremendous opportunity to catch up in Africa, and I would say in developing Asia as well. But it will not happen automatically. It will not happen simply by waiting for markets to lift us. It requires a concerted strategy. It requires policy activism, and it requires collaboration within regions and internationally. Africa is also the site of numerous governance reforms. And the old image of Africa as having incompetent governments, as being plagued by corruption, as being plagued by poor governance of every form, is now clearly outdated. A series of governance reforms across African states has changed the way the world looks at Africa. And finally, Africa is also a site of some of the most impressive innovations in the social and economic field. The mobile phone revolution has proceeded faster in Africa than in most other developing regions. The way in which small farmers can now make payments, aggregate supply, and cut out intermediaries, dealing directly with wholesalers, the way in which they can price their crops and get information on the weather and other conditions all on the mobile phone, and even the way in which they can buy solar energy using their mobile. All these are ways in which Africa is using innovation to meet real needs on the ground and at the same time leapfrog compared to what many other regions are doing. It's a time of opportunity and a time of challenge. But I'll have to say the next decade will be critical. The next decade in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are really critical because we have a very large bulge of our populations that is going to be entering the workforce. 500 million Africans are less than 15 years old. 500 million Africans less than 15 years old. That's about 50% more than China at the peak of its young population, which was 30 years ago. That's when China was at its peak of a young population that was not yet had not yet entered the workforce. But Africa has 50% more than China did 30 years ago. And Africa, like China then, had tremendous challenges in educating and skilling up its young population. But what happened in China is an indication of what is also possible in Africa. In fact, China, 3 decades ago, when it had that peak of a youthful bulge in its population, had only 37% enrollment in secondary schools, which is about the same as where sub-Saharan Africa is today. That was in 1990. 10 years later, China had 60% of its young people in secondary schools, moving from 37% to 60% in 10 years. And in 20 years, it moved to 88%. And today, it has well over 90% enrollment in secondary schools. It didn't happen naturally. It happened because of a concerted push on the part of government to recruit and train up teachers, to develop systems of accountability, and to inject a broad spread of quality across its education system. A massive effort, but it shows it can be done. And I'll come back to this later, but this, to me, is going to be the determinant of Africa's future and the determinant of the future of stability and growth in the global community. This large 500 million people in Africa who are still below the age of 15 will either be a quiet tsunami, a quiet but visible tsunami in the years to come, or a massive opportunity for growth and the spread of prosperity in Africa and globally. Second reason why the next decade is critical is that technologies are changing. And the way in which global value chains, which powered East Asia's growth and some other parts of the world's growth, the way in which global value chains are being structured, where they're being located, and what takes place in different countries is changing, and is changing rapidly. Global value chains 10 years from now are going to be very different from what they were 10 years ago. And Africa has a small window, not a long window, to be able to get into global value chains and benefit the same way that some parts of East Asia did in the last 30 years. Not a long window, I would say 5 to 10 years. 5 to 10 years maximum to be able to get into global value chains, specialize in areas where Africa has comparative advantage, and contribute not just to Africa, but contribute to the world. So the global environment is changing, it is slowing, it is getting more friction, an environment with greater friction and tensions. It's not as propitious as it was for China 30 years ago. And it means that we now need a lot more urgency in tackling the problems that are fundamental to growth, to inclusivity, and to environmental sustainability. We cannot afford to fail in Africa. And I will highlight what I believe are the 5 strategic orientations that we require in policy making in order to succeed, to grow, and to achieve inclusive and sustainable growth in particular. 5 basic orientations that come from the lessons we've learned all over the world. Lessons we've learned within Africa, lessons we've learned within Asia, and the lessons of development that have come about through the last few decades of experience. So that I don't stretch your patience, let me assure you that when I talk about 5 basic strategic orientations, I'll be a little longer with the first 2, but I'll be much faster with the rest, because the 5 are interrelated. And I'll spend some time on the first 2 strategic orientations, but they're all bound up together. First and foremost, we've got to maximize and spread the benefits of economic openness. Economic openness is a tremendous enabler of growth, but it is not on its own what produces inclusive growth. It is not on its own something that spreads prosperity. It lifts prosperity in the aggregate. It raises average standards of living within countries and globally, but it does not on its own spread prosperity from large firms to small firms across gender and ethnic group and across socio-economic classes within societies. So we have to work harder to maximize and spread the benefits of economic openness. Globalization and technological change are not the problem. It is policy responses to globalization and technological change that are the issue. That's the heart of the matter. And that's why some countries have done much better than others. In fact, some of the most open societies and some of the societies most exposed to technological change, like Sweden, like Singapore, like some others, have been the ones who've achieved the broadest spread of prosperity, the broadest, the ones that have achieved wage growth, not just on average, but across all segments of society. So it's not globalization, it's not technological change. It's our policy responses and how we organize ourselves to maximize the benefits and spread the benefits in society. The core idea in economic strategy for us to do so is to take advantage of what the economists call the economics of agglomeration. And this means being able to specialize in certain areas in each of our countries, develop scale around those specializations, develop clusters of large and small players up and down the supply chain within those specializations. If we do that well, if we develop strong and competitive clusters in the specializations that we have some advantage in, some comparative advantage in, there's a way in which the economics of agglomeration works that attracts a lot more suppliers as well as a lot more customers, and critically, there's a way in which it develops skills. A strategy of clusters and industrial specialization or economic specialization allows us to develop skills and move up the value chain over time as skills beget skills. The way in which East Asia did it may be different from the way Africa is going to do it. East Asia focused on electronics, textiles, light manufacturing. I think there's still significant scope for light manufacturing as a specialization in Africa, but Africa has got a huge opportunity in agribusinesses. All along the value chain of agribusiness, Africa has a huge opportunity, not just to be able to grow within Africa, but to be able to power global growth. The entire value chain, production of agricultural inputs, developing higher yields amongst farmers, developing cold storage and logistical systems that minimize wastage, and developing the services upstream and downstream along the value chain. It's a huge opportunity for Africa. Second, tradable services, still a huge opportunity. And I say this, by the way, because there's some despondency today about whether global value chains and manufacturing still has a future. And I believe it still has if we take this opportunity in the next 5 to 10 years, in light industry as well as in agribusiness, which is going to be Africa's forte. But services too are an opportunity. Tradable services, including IT-based services and remote offices, are still a very significant opportunity, but they require education and skills. Tourism remains a very substantial opportunity for Africa. So the verticals that Africa specializes in may differ somewhat from the way East Asia did it, but the basic principle of maximizing the economics of agglomeration or achieving specialization and scale through specialization is the same. And in agribusiness, you know this far better than I do, but there's some critical requirements and critical gaps today that need to be plugged. The need to improve yields in farming, and the techniques are already there, both using modern crop varieties, hybrid seeds, even modest fertilizer has been able to achieve leaps in productivity in agriculture in some countries, but not others. So it shows that it can be scaled up. The need to reduce wastage due to inefficient supply chains is fundamental. Having supply chains that allow small-scale farmers to avoid a significant part of their crops being wasted has to be central to economic strategy and to our strategy for agribusiness. And there are, again, very impressive innovations. Coal Hubs, which some of you may have heard, a Nigerian startup, is developing solar refrigerators. Imagine, solar refrigerators. That's an oxymoron only in words, but it's a reality. Developing outdoor solar-powered cold rooms, -5 degrees centigrade, so that farmers and collectives of farmers can take advantage of cold rooms distributed not too far from their farms, so as to be able to extend the shelf life of their crops from what is an average of 2 days to 21 days. So you can imagine the reduction in post-harvest loss that comes about as a result of that. That's one example. Many other examples. In Ghana, ready-to-eat pineapples. PPP partnership that involve cleaning and slicing the pineapples into portions, packaging it for the retail market, shipping it the same evening by air so that it appears the very next morning in London supermarkets. That's what supply chain efficiency is about, and it can be done. So when we see each of these examples of innovation, they're not just examples that make us impressed, they're examples that make us think, how do we scale it up? How do we scale it up? That has to be a priority. Scale up the innovations already taking place in Africa. Next, in how we make the most of openness and spread the benefits is regionalization. And we all know about the very impressive move that Africa is taking to form the AFC FTA, African Community FTA. Massive potential. But what's critical is not just the scale of a regional arrangement. What's critical is that it remains open to the rest of the world. In other words, regionalization in some parts of the world leads to greater insularity, and in some other parts of the world, it leads to a constant drive for openness towards the rest of the world. And one of the things that we've done in ASEAN has been to develop a system of open regionalization where ASEAN integrates, breaks down barriers within itself, but it's also an ASEAN that is linking up with other regions and other trading partners. And that experience that ASEAN has taken of open regionalization has been central to the growth path that we are on today. The AFC FTA has a similar opportunity. You're linking up existing trading arrangements within Africa, but it's critical that you forge linkages with the rest of the world in order to get to scale, not just within Africa, but get to scale globally, and in order to reach technological frontiers. It is now more possible to do this than before, precisely because of the digital revolution. It is more possible to achieve scale and to get faster to the technological frontiers because of digitization. One of the things that is, I think, most unique about ASEAN's regionalization is the fact that we started with an ASEAN economic community, but we're now linking up through FTAs with other regions. The largest, of course, is the CPTPP, largest free trade area so far. The RCEP, just concluded amongst 15 countries, excluding India for now. All these are ways in which ASEAN was not just integrating and reducing barriers within itself, but was spreading liberalization by linking up with other partners. And what it really does at the end of the day is it injects a different dynamic within our regions, not one where we can only move as fast as the slowest member or the least open member, but one in which individual members, whilst being members of a regional arrangement, can take the lead in forging ahead and creating links with the rest of the world. In other words, let the fastest members act as pathfinders for the rest of the group. And in fact, Singapore has been a pathfinder for ASEAN with many of our FTAs, creating FTAs with external partners who subsequently become partners for ASEAN as a whole. I just want to emphasize also a point which is often neglected, that regionalization is not just about reducing or eliminating tariffs. It's also about speeding up the transfer of goods and services across borders. Time is a critical issue, and avoiding delay at borders is a critical issue for any business. And what we're doing now in ASEAN, which may be of interest, is we are piloting a system which we call ASEAN Customs Transit System, or ACTS, which involves computerized customs transit management. Now, why is this important? It's because when you take goods from one part of a region to another that involves many countries, you're often going through countries on a transit basis in order to get to your final destination. So you go through several borders before you get to your final destination. And the norm internationally and in many regions, including much of Asia and Africa, is that at each border you have to unload, you have to get customs checks once again, and tremendous time can be wasted. In fact, often you have to load your goods back onto another truck. So what we're doing through this new system is avoiding the need for unloading, for transferring, or even for customs checks through a computerized customs transit management system. The first phase is already now underway between Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand, and the next phase involving Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam will be starting next year. I mention this because it's an often neglected issue in regionalization. It's not just about the tariffs, it's also about frictionless movement across borders. Africa and ASEAN have ties which I would say are still nascent. Our ties are not very strong. ASEAN look to China, US, and Europe as its major markets. Africa look to Europe and some other parts of the advanced world. But we have to now come together in a world where trade is under threat, where supply chains are under threat, we have to strengthen our ties between our two regions. And there is fortunately growing interest. There's certainly, as President Adesina mentioned, significant interest by our Singapore businesses in Africa, including West Africa. We already, in fact, the 8th largest foreign investor in Africa. Just last year, Singapore invested about US dollars 19 billion in Africa. But we need to take practical steps to spur this collaboration. More BITs, bilateral investment treaties, that provide some assurance to investors. More DTAs, avoidance of double taxation. These agreements too are critical for businesses. More financial connectivity, including tapping on fintech to reduce today's significant inefficiencies that still remain in the cross-border payment system and cross-border trade finance and insurance. And we need greater air connectivity, which still remains very weak between Asia and Africa, and particularly between East Asia and Africa. But we must also think about the intangibles. It's not just about the tangible aspects of connectivity, but the intangibles of how we can learn faster, how we can get learning between regions take place more quickly to our mutual benefit. And I'm glad that a very large number of African officials have taken advantage of the Singapore Cooperation Program, which involves training of officials at many levels, but we're very keen to expand that. And President Adesina and I just agreed earlier today on developing a linkage between the African Development Institute and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in order to spur this learning between two regions, particularly learning between policymakers based on our experiences so that we don't make the same mistakes the others have made and we can replicate successes wherever possible. So it's an example of how we can get an institutional tie-up to spur this learning between our regions. The second, I told you I was going to spend longer on the initial strategic orientations, and I've spent a long time on the first, which is about maximizing and spreading the benefits of openness. But the second one is also critical. And that is that we've got to invest more boldly in the social foundations of growth. We can't get inclusive growth, we can't get sustainable growth, we can't get durable growth without investing more boldly in the social foundations of growth. And it creates not just the tangible economic benefits of a spread of prosperity, it also is what creates a sense of togetherness amongst people. It's that investing in the social foundations, in education, in healthcare, and in public goods generally, that we create that sense of togetherness amongst people of different backgrounds, including different ethnic backgrounds. And it is what creates optimism in the future. Investment in the social foundations is what creates the greatest optimism in the future and reduces the appeal of extremism, which is still very real in many parts of the world. Education is central, and I spoke briefly about it earlier. The fundamentals or the basics are still a huge challenge in Africa, and I would say in South Asia as well. In Africa, on a learning-adjusted basis, because I spoke earlier about secondary school enrollment, the fact that you have about 36 or 37% of the relevant age group in secondary school enrollment, but that's not adjusted for actual quality of education and actual learning, actual competencies. When you adjust it for actual competencies, Africa has a more major challenge, as does some other developing regions. In fact, most African countries, on a learning-adjusted basis, have only 6 years of education on average amongst their young people. Put another way, only 10% of Africa's young are achieving the minimum levels of proficiency in reading and mathematics that are expected at the end of primary school. So people are going through primary school and moving on to secondary school, but only 10% of them have that proficiency. So this has to be a central focus. we're not going to succeed in any of our other goals if we do not raise the standard of basic education and think about it not just in terms of quantity, but quality. The key to this is teachers. In other words, the key to developing human capital is in fact the human capital in the education system, the teachers. How we recruit them, how we train them, how we reward them on a performance basis, and how we develop careers that are attractive. That, frankly, was a source of strength and still is the source of strength in Singapore's education system. It's teachers. It's about hiring good people, rewarding them well, training them well throughout their careers, and making it an attractive career. And we see examples in Africa of how this is happening. In fact, in Rwanda, they have not long ago adopted a system of performance-based pay for teachers, which is still very rare internationally, by the way, rewarding teachers not just on the basis of seniority, but on the basis of performance. And studies have already found, the research has already found, that this switch to performance-based pay has resulted in a significant increase in pupils' learning, in students' learning, and the quality of learning. So much is to be done in basic education. Tertiary education is also an area where we have major problems. And here it's not just in Africa, but I would say globally. There is a very large mismatch between the skills that people are being trained for in tertiary education and the skills in demand in the marketplace. And that mismatch is evident in Africa as well. Far too few graduates in the STEM disciplines, far too few people trained in technical and vocational skills, and too many people trained in a very general form of education. This mismatch doesn't serve anyone. It doesn't serve the individuals concerned, doesn't serve their families who often are putting aside family savings for education, and it doesn't serve our whole societies. So we have to tackle this mismatch and go for a more skills-based tertiary education that gives people a real chance of doing well in the job market. And finally, in education, we need political accountability. The classic problem in education is that the benefits of investing in education today and improving educational systems are seen many years down the road. If I'm talking about a young kid who's entering primary school at the age 5 or 6, it's only when that kid is 18 or 19 that you see significant outcomes that change the course of a whole population. And it's only by the time they're in their early 20s, when they finish a tertiary education, that we really see the benefits of what we did 17 or 18 years ago. It creates a political problem. Politicians, particularly in democracies, who are competing one electoral term at a time, do not have enough incentive to invest in education when the results and the full results are only evident much further down the road. There are solutions. There are ways in which we've got to improve the accountability of today's politicians for investments in education, and there are ways in which we've got to shine a light of transparency on what is happening in education across the developing world. And there are good examples. In fact, in Liberia, the presidential candidate that set up PPPs to improve school quality was rewarded by voters in the areas where these PPPs succeeded in raising school quality, and was also punished by voters. The same candidate was also punished by voters in areas where school quality went down. But it just shows that populations aren't dumb. Populations aren't blind to what is happening. We've got to shine a light of transparency on what's happening in education, get families and women involved in demanding accountability on the part of politicians. It's a fundamental flaw in democracies that can be corrected. Investing in the long term must pay off politically in the short term, and if you don't do it, you have to be punished in the short term. I want to mention too, when we talk about the social foundations, I spoke at length about education. I'm not going to spend too much time on healthcare, simply in order to manage the time in the speech, but I must mention that a neglected area when we talk about the social foundations of growth is housing, particularly public housing for the majority of people. It's a huge need in Africa. It's a huge need in many parts of Asia. And we have to realize that it's not just a functional issue of avoiding slums and avoiding sort of informal housing where there's no sanitation and you can't have a basic standard of living that's decent. It's more than that. It's about creating a sense of ownership in people. Ownership in the country, ownership in economic progress, and ownership in social cohesion. Because if we design public housing well, and if we design urban neighborhoods well, what you might call social urban planning, not just urban planning, but social urban planning. If we do that well, we also give everyone a sense of togetherness, a sense that everyone is in it together. It spurs social cohesion. So these intangibles that come about from well-designed housing and urban planning are extremely important. They've been critical to Singapore's path to development. In fact, Singapore in many ways is a country whose foundations comprise of housing and education. And even today, 85% of our population lives in public housing, which means it's not just for the poor, it's for everyone from the poor to, at the very least, the upper middle class, all mixed up together in the same neighborhoods. I want to emphasize this because it's very often neglected by economists, and economists talk about industry, they talk about education, fortunately, but not enough attention is given to housing and the development of integrated neighborhoods. Third, strategic orientation, and I'll now be a little more brief. Thinking long-term is itself a strategic orientation in government that is fundamental to both social and economic development. And that involves two aspects. First, we have to develop financial resilience in order to achieve long-term success in economic development. If you look at all the successful examples around the world, in East Asia or elsewhere, of developing countries that have started off poor and have gone beyond the middle income tier, first and foremost, they all raised savings rates. Without high domestic savings, it's very hard to have resilience in domestic investments because you're always at the mercy of the vagaries of international finance or the vagaries of borrowed finance. So savings rates are critical. Raising national savings rates was what we did and is what several other East Asian countries did. And it's how we were able to fund high rates of investment nationally that allowed us to lift off from an initial stage of development and to get well beyond middle income status. But second aspect of financial resilience is the government. Systems of domestic tax administration are a critical prerequisite for success. It's not just your tax rates, but your system of tax administration. And in fact, I should add that Singapore is a country with relatively low tax rates of any form. Consumption taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, all our tax rates are low by international standards. But tax administration is how we ensure that there's zero leakage. And paying attention to systems of tax administration has got a lot of bang for the buck. It's not something that costs a lot of money. It's about putting in place systems of accountability and systems that ensure that there's zero tolerance for corruption. A related aspect is what we do with the money we raise. What do we do with the government revenue? Spending based on value has to be the credo of government fiscal planning. Clear prioritization of projects. We can't choose projects on a purely opportunistic basis, depending on which lender comes along and expresses interest in a particular project. We've got to think through the social and economic spillovers that come from our projects and prioritize projects with the highest long-term value. And we have to think through also the life cycle costs of infrastructure, again, greatly neglected, because very often in the project game, there's a lot of focus on the upfront costs and not enough focus on the life cycle costs. And when we talk about life cycle costs today, we also have to think about life cycle environmental costs, because what we do in infrastructure today will shape the future of sustainability in our economies. And thirdly, when we talk about financial resilience, I spoke first about getting national savings rates up. I then spoke about fiscal policy, domestic tax administration, and prioritizing spending based on value. The third aspect is we have to develop domestic financial markets. And here, in a large part of the developing world, including Africa, there's still a lot to be done, in particular to develop local currency, bond and equity markets. It provides resilience in a world where global finance is volatile, and I think one of the unfortunate side effects of a decade of very cheap money globally has been that we've lost our focus on these fundamentals, raising national savings, not just relying on external flows of capital, improving tax administration and spending wisely, and developing domestic financial markets. These are the fundamentals of financial resilience, and we shouldn't lose sight of it. Environmental sustainability is obviously core to thinking long term. And here I really want to commend the African Development Bank for taking the lead on this. I know you've now made a policy decision to stop financing coal power, but importantly, you're also helping to power the transition to clean energy. And President Adesina was just telling me about this latest innovation. You call it desert to power. Fascinating innovation, using solar energy in the Sahel, a region that people often write off, but which has huge potential to show how the transition to clean energy is possible. In order to reduce the trade-off between growth and sustainability in the developing world, we must have more innovation. Otherwise, you have a sharp trade-off. Otherwise, it means in order to pay attention to sustainability, you need to sacrifice growth. And that's the wrong way of thinking about it. We should be tapping on every innovation and scaling up every innovation that can reduce the cost of alternative energies, that can raise agricultural yields so as to reduce deforestation, that can help farmers diversify, that can help in capturing more value within economies by having more processing. All these economic strategies and all the innovations in the world of sustainability are needed to reduce this trade-off between growth and sustainability, because countries aren't going to stop growing, and emerging countries and developing countries have to continue to grow and continue to catch up with the standards of living that are possible and have been shown in more advanced countries. So we cannot sacrifice growth, but we have to scale up innovations and scale up that improvement in agricultural yields, in diversification, and in processing. And frankly, as I mentioned earlier, Africa has been a site of very interesting innovations. I talked about cold storage. There are other examples of how solar energy is being used, not just to make this transition to sustainability, but also to spur growth in Africa. Mawingu, which is Swahili for cloud, is a very interesting example in Kenya and some other parts of West Africa, where solar-powered Wi-Fi hotspots in remote areas are being made possible using TV white space, so that internet access is brought to rural areas. Many other examples. Let me come now to the fourth strategic orientation. And this is again often neglected in the development literature and in the academic literature. But as policymakers, it's a very real issue in our minds. Quite apart from maximizing the benefits of openness, which was my first orientation I spoke about, quite apart from investing in the social foundations, the second strategic orientation, quite apart from developing financial resilience and environmental sustainability, or thinking long-term, which is the third orientation. We must also be concerned about maximizing policy coherence and effectiveness. Because in truth, that's what distinguishes the successful countries from the rest. It's not individual policies, it is several policies being combined and undertaken together in a coherent fashion. That's what distinguishes the successful regions from those that haven't yet succeeded. It's bringing together several policies, tackling social mobility, tackling maternal health, having active industrial strategies that create jobs, but having the skills that feed into those jobs, investing in public goods so that the infrastructure is there that enables industrial policies to succeed, tackling corruption, ensuring enough competition in our economies so that there's no capturing of rents by a small group of vested interests. Everything hangs together. If we merely have an active industrial strategy, we're not going to succeed. We must develop the skills. We must ensure that the rewards of this strategy are not captured by a few vested interests. We must be able to inspire optimism on the part of people so that they know that short-term costs are worth paying because there's going to be long-term benefit. So policy coherence and having a very clear long-term narrative is critical in economic success, but also critical for that sense of social cohesion. And I think there are enough examples, not just from international experience of how this can be done, but there are also fascinating examples in small-scale, on-the-ground, micro-experiments. For instance, it's been found that better water, sanitation, and hygiene also leads to higher productivity of proteins and calories in child health formation. We know you need protein, we know you need calories for child health formation, but better water, sanitation, and hygiene is critical to improving the productivity of the protein and the productivity of the calories. That's one example. Cash transfers and clear instructions or communications to pregnant women has been critical in preventing childhood stunting, which is in turn critical for lifetime performance. And this has been found in some parts of India, in Myanmar, and many other places. So things hang together. It's not about one policy, healthcare, or another policy, early childhood education, or an active industrial policy. Things have to cohere, they have to hang together, and they have to be pursued together in order that we succeed. Finally, my final strategic orientation I want to talk about is something which President Adesina has been very involved in, which is that we've got to maximize the benefits of global finance as a system, not just individual multilateral development banks, individual commercial banks, but maximize the benefits of the system. The needs of Africa in particular, in infrastructure and in human capital development, are much larger than official finance alone is going to be able to provide. They're much larger than anything that has been provided historically. For infrastructure alone, we need something like $100 billion a year. It can only come through private finance. But in order to attract private finance, and especially private equity finance, because we can't keep piling up debts in our countries, it has to be equity finance increasingly. In order to crowd in private finance and equity finance, we've got to de-risk the environment. Not just de-risk individual projects, but de-risk a whole class of projects and de-risk an investment environment across geographies. And this requires some innovation in global finance. It requires pooling together assets to create a combined asset class across different sectors and across different geographies, and being able to develop that asset class with some risk mitigation. The African Development Bank is tying up with MIGA has been a pioneer in risk mitigation, the MIGA for political risk insurance, but also a pioneer in risk mitigation that involves taking first loss guarantees. But we've got to do everything we can to attract private capital. There is no lack of private capital in the global economy that can be invested in Africa and in the developing world. All it requires is the right risk-reward ratio, and we've got to de-risk the investment instruments to make it possible for private capital to flow in our direction. Institutional investors are critical. The pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and insurers. No lack of assets available. In fact, it's about $100 trillion globally in institutional investors' hands. And right now, only a minuscule amount of that is invested in developing country infrastructure. By pooling together assets, by de-risking that pool of assets, we can attract a significant flow of funds from institutional investors. And here I really want to commend what the African Development Bank has done, both through your Africa 50 initiatives, as well as your Room to Run initiative to securitize assets and to then pass the mezzanine credit risk on to institutional investors. You've been taking the lead, and we're doing what we can in Asia as well, but critically, we've got to work across geographies, across the MDBs, and President Adesina, as the chair of the presidents of the MDBs this year, has been pushing and achieving some momentum in this effort. So think of global finance not just as individual projects and individual investors. Think of it as a system and de-risk infrastructural investment, especially in developing countries, by pooling together risks, injecting risk guarantees, first loss guarantees, or other forms of risk mitigation in order to crowd in private finance. It's the only way we are going to succeed in getting enough funding for the developing world in this next decade and beyond. So I've covered these 5 strategic orientations: maximizing and spreading the benefits of economic openness, investing in the social foundations of growth much more boldly, and not just in education, but also in housing. Thinking long-term, raising national savings rate, developing more resilient domestic budgets, which means improving tax administration, and prioritizing spending on infrastructure to focus on projects that have the largest spin-offs or spillovers, socially and economically. Thinking about policy coherence, not just individual policies and individual initiatives, but policy coherence, because that's critical in success. And finally, collaborating globally so that we make the most of global finance as a system, and the sum is much larger, and the whole is much larger than the sum of its parts. If we can do these things, they're not new. There's nothing original that we have just learned, but these are the lessons coming out of experience of the last 30 years in Asia, in Africa, in the rest of the developing world. If we can focus every government to focus on these strategic orientations, I think we have more than a fair chance of succeeding, and succeed we must in Africa. Thank you very much.
Mr. Tharman, Shanmugaratnam, Senior Minister and Coordinating Minister for Social Policies for Singapore. Ladies and gentlemen, our eminent speaker has packed a lot into his presentation today, and I think he deserves an even warmer and much more resounding applause today. Thank you very much, sir. There's absolutely no need at this point to re-emphasize the 5 strategic orientations that you have mentioned. You've not only encapsulated them very well, but you've also rounded off your presentation, again highlighting them. But I think what stands out for me from this presentation is the fact that you mentioned right off the back that this is a time indeed for Africa, either of great challenge or great opportunity. Scenarios don't just happen, they don't just take place. The future doesn't just happen. They are the end results of what we put in each and every day, either in terms of policy, in terms of practice, and more importantly, the political will to transform our societies. Excellency, thank you very much. At this point, we will take questions, and I hope I've seen you take a lot of notes today. I'm sure you do have questions that you would like to extend to our eminent speaker. So, as is the practice in this hall, nobody likes asking question number 1, so we'll skip ahead very quickly and go on to question number 2. So, question number 2. And we welcome questions from every member of the audience, including our executive directors here. And just as a short housekeeping rule here, we would prefer for you to mention your name first. If you work at the bank, the department or complex that you work with, if you're visiting from the public, again, identify yourself accordingly. And Excellency, we do have quite a number of students here from some of our local institutions, and I'm sure they also have some questions for you. We'll take our first batch of questions. We'll take about 3 or 4 questions and then come back to you again with follow-up questions. So first of all, can I see a show of hands so that way we know where we come to? I see someone over here. We'll start with you first. We'll come to Tim second, and then I see the hand of a student raised on the left. So we'll do that in that formation and then come back to the audience afterwards. So our first question right in the middle over here. Thank you.
معالي السيد وزير الدولة.
Excellence, Monsieur le ministre d'État.
السيد محافظ البنك الأفريقي للتنمية.
Excellence, Monsieur le Président de la Banque africaine de développement.
السفراء.
Excellence, Monsieur les ambassadeurs.
السادة الخبراء والمهتمين.
Excellence, Monsieur les experts et
السادة والسيدات.
Monsieur, Mesdames et Messieurs.
اسمحوا لي في البداية بصفتي رئيس بعثة سفارة ليبيا لدى جمهورية كوت ديفوار.
Je me présente avant tout propos. Je suis l'ambassadeur de l'État de Libye accrédité en République de Côte d'Ivoire.
وكذلك بصفتي الهامشية كأستاذ في الجامعات الليبية وأكاديمية الدراسة العليا في ليبيا.
Aussi en ma qualité d'académicien ou de professeur de l'Académie libyenne pour la formation des diplomates.
أولا أريد أن أحيي السيد محافظ البنك الأفريقي للتنمية على هذه المبادرة المتميزة الحقيقة.
Je tenais à adresser mes vifs remerciements au président du groupe de la Banque africaine de développement pour cette initiative.
وذلك من خلال استضافته لوزير دولة في قارة آسيا، دولة تميزت على مستوى دول الجنوب بتقدماتها وتطوراتها على كافة الصعد.
Ainsi, je voudrais aussi adresser mes remerciements pour toutes ces avancées réalisées sur tous les plans.
أنا أعيد، لا لم أقل كذلك، قلت لك يعني باستضافته لوزير دولة سنغافور.
En qualité de Monsieur, Excellence, Monsieur le ministre de Singapour.
لعل الدول الأفريقية بعددها 54 دولة تقتدي بالتجربة الرائدة التي خاضتها هذه الدولة في آسيا.
Il se pourrait que les pays de l'Afrique, qui composés de 54 États, pourront bien suivre l'exemple ou les orientations données ici par Excellence et Monsieur le ministre.
إذن حتى لا أطيل.
Pour ne pas être trop long.
هذا تعقيب وليس سؤال سيد مدير الجلسة.
Ceci est un compliment, mais pas une question.
إذن أتمن الجهد الذي يقوم به المصرف الأفريقي للتنمية بسلسلة المحاضرات التي ينظمها بشكل منتظم.
Je rends hommage à la banque et à ses dirigeants pour ces grands développements réalisés.
وهو بذلك يمشي في خطين متوازيين.
Et en cela, il marche dans deux droites parallèles.
الجانب الوظيفي التنفيذي.
Le côté fonctionnel.
والجانب الأكاديمي البحثي.
Et le côté académicien propre.
وهذا خلق نوع من التزاوج ما بين المسارين.
Ce qui a engendré une sorte de cohérence entre les deux lignes.
وهذه خطوة تحسب للسيد المحافظ البنك والإخوة العاملين على مستوى هذه المؤسسة الإفريقية العالمية الرائدة.
Ce qui nous amène à remercier énormément ces efforts déployés par la banque.
السيد المحاضر السيد معالي الوزير لدي تعقيب فيما يخص اقتدائك بالنموذج الصيني ومقارنة جمهورية الصين الشعبية في آسيا بالدول الأفريقية. لدي ملاحظة فيما يخص مقارنة جمهورية الصين الشعبية ب 54 دولة أفريقية.
J'ai une remarque à faire au niveau de la comparaison de l'Afrique à la Chine.
الصين دولة واحدة ذات توجهات واحدة.
La Chine est un État qui a une seule orientation.
est un seul pays.
Un seul pays, la Chine.
Qui a une orientation politique distinguée. On ne peut pas comparer la Chine avec 54 pays africains qui ont de multiples orientations. Ça, c'est une chose. Deuxième chose, vous avez dit, monsieur le conférencier, que la Chine a pu un jour se déclencher et a pu se progresser depuis 30 ans. Et cette opportunité ne peut pas être offerte devant les pays africains. À mon avis, les pays africains, si elles emboîtent le bas à votre pays et aux autres pays en voie de développement, elles peuvent aller en avant et plus que ça, à mon avis. Donc, monsieur le conférencier, c'est tout ce que je peux dire à ce que vous avez vraiment développé. Mais en ce qui concerne les orientations que vous avez notées tout récemment, les 5 orientations, le fait par exemple que les économies des pays en voie de développement, en l'occurrence les pays africains, il faut qu'ils s'ouvrent devant les économies internationales. Monsieur le conférencier, à mon avis, il faut être prudent. Supposons qu'une économie très sophistiquée, en l'occurrence l'économie d'un pays en Afrique, s'ouvre d'une manière absolue devant l'économie internationale. À mon avis, et autant que je sache, il y a des risques. Il y a des risques. C'est-à-dire, sous prétexte que. Et je vous remercie, monsieur le conférencier.
His Excellency, the Ambassador of Libya to Côte d'Ivoire. Thank you very much, Excellency. We'll come to Tim with the third question, actually. Could we pass the microphone right over to the middle, right over here, right over here.
Thank you very much. I'd like to, first of all, thank you for mentioning the balance sheet optimization, all the investor mobilization activities that the bank has done. I had the honor of being part of President Adesina's team that worked on several of those transactions. I'd like to touch, though, on I think it's number 3 or was it number 4, the point that you made around policy coherence and the importance of policy coherence. So number 4, in order to really get the kind of impact you want, and not to dilute impact. And one of the things that we observed as we were developing all these different instruments to catalyze and mobilize institutional investors into our sector was that there was often kind of conflicting policy priorities that didn't necessarily lead us in the same direction. One example of that would be around preferred creditor treatment. our institutions rely on preferred creditor treatment as a fundamental underpinning of our credit ratings. As a preferred creditor, you'd like to naturally keep your preferred debt down because it's more valuable when it's small. On the other hand, we have the the Addis Accord, where we're talking about billions to trillions to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And we found that these were sort of policy priorities that seem to be in tension. I'm wondering whether, all the great work that you've done in the G20 and that thinking, whether or not there's some more thought around how to sharpen the policy coherence around things like preferred creditor treatment and using the MDBs as a conduit more effectively to catalyze institutional investors. I'd appreciate your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. Just in the interest of time, may I kindly ask that we keep our questions short, brief, straight to the point, so that we can take a multiplicity of questions in the short time that we have available. Thank you very much for kindly giving attention to that. We'll go to the students to my extreme left over here. We'll start with the student right over there, to my left. Kindly pass a microphone to him. The young man to my left over there. Can we move very quickly and pass a microphone to him? Thank you.
Ok. Bonjour, Excellence, Monsieur le ministre d'État. Bonjour également, Messieurs le Président de la BAD et distingués invités. Alors, je vais être très bref dans ma question, mais elle a deux volets. Alors, Monsieur le ministre d'État, vous aviez parlé des indices de développement. Je suis d'accord, donc la santé, l'éducation, le logement, et ainsi de suite. Mais vous avez oublié de mentionner un indice qui est très important, qui est le volet sécurité. On ne pourrait parler de développement quand la sécurité ne nous est pas garantie. Alors, ma question est de qu'est-ce que vous nous proposez sur le volet sécurité pour mieux appréhender la conception du développement? Et le deuxième volet, c'est que vous aviez beaucoup encouragé la croissance démographique. C'est vrai que d'ici un nombre d'années, l'Afrique pourrait représenter une main-d'œuvre importante, d'accord, donc pour le monde entier déjà. Mais quand la croissance démographique atteint un niveau assez important, elle pourrait représenter un danger pour notre société. Je prends un exemple très court. Je prends un bocal d'eau. Quand je remplis l'eau, au fil que l'eau essaie de remplir, quand elle arrive à bord, elle verse. Pourtant, il y a un territoire qui est bien défini. L'homme peut s'être grandi, on peut grandir en homme, mais le territoire ne peut pas grandir. Comment pourrons-nous se développer avec ce grand nombre de personnes-là d'un territoire qui est bien défini et qui est très petit, surtout avec l'avancée de l'eau de l'océan? Merci, Monsieur le ministre d'État.
Thank you very much. We'll take the last question for now, and then we'll come to our eminent speaker or any other members of the panel.
Your Excellency, President and Honorable Minister, my name is Srivatsan. I'm from OLAM, head of Africa and Middle East. I'm part of the minister's delegation. Just one question, Minister, you spoke about the importance of education and the youthful population, what Africa is going to have in the next 50 years. But one of the key issues is malnutrition and stunted growth. And I believe that's fundamental, even before somebody starts going to school. That's one of the big issues. And I'm not sure whether the governments alone, with their meager resources and the ability to tackle these issues. Unlike we saw in Asia, many of the governments have been successfully able to tackle this. So I believe that in Africa, the PPP model, even for the healthcare delivery, and especially tackling the malnutrition and malnutrition among the young children, there has to be a PPP model. The public-private partnership model will be more effective, and I would like to have your thoughts on this.
Minister Shanmugaratnam, over to you.
Thank you. A set of very useful questions. I'll take them quickly one at a time. First, just to add to the very useful comment by our friend from Libya, I would say, all countries face risks when you participate in the global economy or global finance. The question is how we can reduce those risks and maximize the benefits. And the countries that have done this well have succeeded to a greater extent than the others. The issue is not the global economy. The issue is not global trade and investment. The issue is our domestic policy responses to make sure that we provide some security for people and make sure we spread the benefits. So it's not just a handful of people or handful of companies that get the benefits, but you spread the benefits. And it comes down to those strategic orientations, in particular investing in the social foundations of our economies. And when we think of policy coherence, the most important coherence in policy is between social policy and economic policy. And in many governments, to be frank, social policy is given to a junior coalition partner or a less important politician. It's very common all over the world. Education is seen as a junior portfolio. Sometimes healthcare as well, sometimes social welfare or women's welfare. They're seen as junior portfolios. I can tell you in Singapore, those are the most important portfolios. Education is a key portfolio. Healthcare is a key portfolio. And everyone in the cabinet, including the Prime Minister personally, takes a deep interest in education and healthcare. So the social foundations of our society are what drives long-term success. I just wanted to make that point. Second, when we think about participating in the international economy, it's not just for the sake of markets, not just for the sake of economies of scale. There's something to do with learning. When you participate in international markets and compete with foreign competitors, you have to keep learning. And there's that discipline of constant learning that takes you up the curve. You have to keep improving your skills. You have to look at the latest buyer specifications and make sure you meet them. And increasingly sophisticated buyers place demands on you that are beyond what you used to do before. So it's really being on a learning curve. That's the biggest benefit of participating in international competition. You go on a learning curve that is different from domestic competition, particularly if we are in quite small countries. So that's the supply side benefit, which is much more important than the demand side benefit of participating in the global economy. On the question about policy coherence and preferred creditor status and so on is a very good question. First, I would say we need to make headway on what President Adesina and his colleagues amongst the MDB heads are now moving towards, which is the concept of country platforms, where amongst the different multilateral agencies, and I would say even the bilateral agencies, we've got to coordinate our operations and coordinate our funding so that there's coherence amongst us. Too much of the game of multilateral and bilateral finance has been about competing with each other for the biggest plums. We've got to instead coordinate so that we cover the different bases in a country's development strategy, share information, and achieve much more impact that way. So we have to support national policy coherence by being coherent amongst the external lenders themselves. That's one point. On your question specifically about preferred creditor status, I take a practical view. There is a purist view, I know, There is a purist view that says that the official agencies and the multilateral agencies should ensure that the benefits of their preferred creditor status do not pass to the private sector. I would just say we've got to get real. Official finance is going to be just a sliver of what Africa and the developing world needs in the decade to come. We need multiples more finance, and it's not coming. It will only come if official agencies provide risk mitigation. And part of that risk mitigation comes from that preferred creditor status, which is not just a legal construct, it's also a relationship with the government. It's a certain obligation that governments have towards the multilateral agencies. Use it well, and if private investors also benefit from it, I would say so be it, as long as they're investing in developing country infrastructure and human capital development. That's our objective. On the question of security, I think that's a very good point you make, and I didn't touch on that in my speech, but for a significant part of the developing world, without security, you're not going to have economic or social development. We all recognize that. Quite apart from direct measures to deal with security after conflict has broken out, and those direct measures are too much the focus of action. I mean, if you look at the UN, for instance, the UN spends far more on peacekeeping than it does in investing in education or the social foundations or economic strategy. Peacekeeping costs far more than dealing with the fundamentals of social and economic development. So we've got to, apart from dealing with conflicts after they've broken out, we've got to deal with the sources of conflict. And that means, again, those 5 orientations I was talking about. But without growth and without inclusive growth, there's a way in which the world ends up with more and more conflicts. So we've got to tackle things at their source and at their fundamentals and get the basis for inclusive growth in the developing world so that there's less conflict over scarce resources. Water, important issue. I'm not sure if I fully understood that question. I was listening to the translation. But water, there is a water crisis in many parts of the world, including parts of the advanced world. And we need to maximize technological innovation to be able to reuse water, which is now a bit of a Singapore specialization, by the way, because we reuse every drop of water, we recycle every drop of water, but also for us to be able to lower the costs of desalination from the water in the seas. There is also a need to avoid wastage, because wastage of water is a huge issue in the world today. And one of the tough issues we have to ask ourselves is some crops require far more water than others. And some societies may need to move away from water-intensive crops. To be frank, in India, for instance, a large part of the water crisis comes from a dependence on rice as a staple of people's diets. And it takes up a tremendous amount of water. But that's a very important social choice that has to shift, given this reality today of a serious shortage of water. Finally, on the issue, the final question was a very useful one. And I would say, whenever we think about human capital, whenever we think about what is it that develops a person in his or her own life, the earlier we start, the better. The earlier we intervene, the better. And that means, given our understanding from the latest science, it means firstly focusing on maternal health and treating that as a priority, and focusing on the first 3 years of a child's life. If we wait for governments to get their act together, some will and some won't. And I think we cannot afford to wait for every government to get its act together, because we are losing too much of a generation of people in the meantime. And we cannot inflict that cost upon them simply because their governments didn't act. So you're quite right that in many societies and in many developing societies, we need to tap on the expertise and resources of the private sector and the philanthropic sector. There's expertise globally that has to be brought to bear on the challenges of Africa, South Asia, and some other parts of the developing world. We can't wait for governments, but don't leave governments out of the action, because they have a way of frustrating action as well. Make governments part of the solution, but bring them along. And what I mentioned at the very early part of my speech, we need systems in democracies where we can shine a light of transparency on achievements in education and basic health care, and hold local and federal government politicians accountable for results. They won't have all the expertise, they won't have all the resources, but the private sector can come in with expertise and resources. But political accountability for basic education and healthcare is currently in short supply. And the example I gave you of Liberia, there's some other examples of where they've managed to turn it around. And even in a democracy, make politicians accountable.
Thank you, Honourable Minister.
Yeah, I just wanted to support what the Minister was saying about this whole issue of political accountability. Because essentially, it doesn't matter, you know, we are a multilateral development bank, we finance a lot, but the bulk of the financing actually comes from governments, actually not from us. So the efficiency of public expenditure, as you rightly said, is the key thing. But if you look at the poverty that we see, sometimes I wonder, you go to local governments have resources, how do they spend that? On health, on education, on water, on all the things, infrastructure that you see. So we really do need to have political accountability. In fact, it's something that I've been discussing with our own chief economists and group here. It's basically, you can develop indices for that, right? And so politicians come in for 4-year terms or whatever it is, 5 years, 10-year terms, literally can map what the level of poverty is, level of lack of access to water, to education, and so on, across districts. They get access to what we call it constituency development funds, as opposed to actually change those things, and we don't really have a good way of tracking whether those things actually get done. So if you index what they are by the time they come in, the status, and 4 years after you develop your parameters and so on, you again reindex it, what the situation is after 4 or 5 years, and then you essentially rate and rank politicians based on their delivery to their people. And so when it comes to the issue of voting, and I think a key part is selecting the right people, right? Then you can have something that shows you a ranking literally of politicians and based on their ability to deliver. So the electorate must select wisely, not just based when I like their face, I like their tribe, I like their religion. I mean, who cares? It's really their ability to deliver. And I think this issue of political accountability indices, as far as this is concerned, is an area that is a methodological area that we as an institution really want to get into, because we have to empower the citizens. I'm amazed when you talk about your country in terms of water, sanitation, health, and so on, and the point you made about corruption. Zero corruption. I mean, monies of states are not meant for private pockets. They're supposed to deliver public goods for people. So I think part of the lesson also is that Africa has to ensure that its citizens are well informed, its citizens have the right data, its citizens also have the voice, so that politics is not just about ability to vote for somebody. It's really about the ability as well to hold the people that you voted for accountable for results. And I think that's the big lesson that we need to pick out of that issue of political accountability, at least for me, from what the minister said.
Thank you, Dr. Adishina. I believe we have time for just 2 short questions, not comments, questions. I see a hand, the lady in the back right over there, and then I'm going to come right over here to Achaleke. You'll be the last person, followed by my question. I take liberty as a moderator.
Victor, since I have executive directors, they will have, maybe the dean will have a question, and Bale will have a question, and then then you'll be in good shape. Otherwise, you're going to go in the boardroom this afternoon.
Based on that presidential directive and the fact that I didn't see the hands raised earlier, we will come back to Edie Bale and to Edie Okogu. So in this order, we'll start with the lady to my left. We'll come back to Edie Okogu, Edie Bale, and the last question to Achaleke over here. And that will be it. Short questions, straight to the point. Thank you very much.
I'll try and be as short as possible. Amira Al-Masiri, Private Sector Operations at the African Development Bank. Honourable Minister, at the beginning of your speech, you referred to unprecedented time of tensions, one of them being the US and China over global trade, the security of Asia, as well as global power and dominance. Singapore is a trusted ally to both countries. Now, if Lee Kuan Yew was alive, what leadership advice would he give to both President Trump and President Xi when it comes to these issues, and more importantly, with regards to the role of Africa in the global economy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move the microphone right over to the right. Executive Director Okogu.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the speech. Wonderful. Thank you. I'm also an alumnus of the LSC, so we'll speak again later. We have a few of the people in this institution. Just to ask a quick question with respect to the apparent tension between democracy and development. That seems to drive a lot of the issues and problems. Politicians have very short, they are driven by very short-term considerations, and it's always a problem. So a lot of the things you said they are not totally new, which I agree with you. It is how you navigate the problem of democracy, electoral politics, at the same time have a lot of these problems that you've described that we seek to overcome them. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the speaker for the stimulating presentation. And my question, okay, it might be a loaded question, because you did say in your strategic orientation that, one, they're interrelated, and two, these are issues that we have discussed, and you've come up with solutions. And being a member of the board, we're always proffering solutions. So what I wanted to know, because after about 30 years in the development arena, I seem to be like the person, one of my mentors that, gave a speech about maybe 30 years ago and said, I've been in this for 30 years and we're still at the same spot. So we don't seem to be, we have the answers, but we don't seem to be progressing. Some of us are regressing. So the question that I have is, from your experience, could you give us one overriding obstacle to development in our countries, and conversely, probably one catalytic action that could give us that seismic shift? Thank you.
Edie Bale, thank you for your question. Acha?
Thank you, and thank you, Minister, for coming. My name is Acha Leke from Mackenzie. It's actually building on the ED speech. I felt a lot of parallels between what you talked about and what we face on the continent. And a lot of your recommendations around tax revenue, savings, around policy consistency, are well known, right? But somehow we don't get it done. So you didn't talk much about delivery, but I'd love to understand, because we've been able to not just talk about it, but get it done. So what advice do you have for us and for our government on how we can actually get this done in terms of delivery? Thank you.
Achaleke, the chairman of Mackenzie Africa, thank you very much for your question. And Honorable Minister, my question here, if I could just take the liberty, you did mention that global value chains are rapidly changing and that Africa has just 5 to 10 years to take advantage, to get plugged into the global value chain. What's the tipping point here, and why the sense of urgency?
Yes, just one question. So it's on the tax question. When you talk about the need to essentially mobilize a lot more taxes, which is very important. But sometimes I think when we talk about it, we look at nominal tax rates in Africa versus the rest of the world. And the tax to GDP ratio is quite small, that's true. But I don't think it really reflects the reality of the citizens. Because in Europe, in Singapore, in everywhere, governments deliver on taxes. So the question really is, if I have to provide my own water, my own electricity, my own roads, my own security, right? And then plan for my own retirement myself, which are things that governments should do. So what is the rationale that will resonate with a citizen when you have government failure? In other words, governments aren't doing necessarily the things they're supposed to do with the taxes they are collecting. So I guess I just wanted to have your comment on this, because the effective tax rate that African citizens pay in many countries is so high compared to the rest of the world, because they are bearing what governments ought to be doing. So I think it's all a question around tax accountability, the governance over taxes. And I think you mentioned, but I just wanted you to really maybe share your thoughts on that divergence between what we see in terms of the theory of it, but the effective tax rates that people pay because you have, in some cases, a government failure on the use of those.
Dr. Atisha.
Well, thank you. It's an excellent final round of questions. First on China and the US, and this is obviously a very large topic, so I'll be brief. I think both sides have to make significant adjustments in order that this interdependence does not get completely broken. And if it does get broken, there's no winner. Everyone is a loser, including the US and China and the rest of the world. China has to adjust to the reality that it is in a very different position in the global economy today compared to the time it entered the WTO in 1990. It is now a formidable force in global manufacturing, and it occupies a significant part of global consumer markets. And that means the argument is somewhat unique to China because of its scale, cannot be the traditional arguments of developing countries in the WTO. It has to accept that it now has to play by new rules on market access, on intellectual property, on everything to do with transfers of technology. It has to play by new rules in order to sustain this global game that benefits not just China but the world. How to sustain it? China has to make some adjustments. And the US has to adjust to the reality that the global economy has succeeded in pulling up China and a significant part of the emerging world, and power is no longer concentrated the way it used to be. It doesn't mean that we are in a completely flat world. I think the US is still a formidable influence economically, politically, and security-wise. But the US now has to share power in a durable fashion. And the US has to adjust to that reality that you have China, you have Europe, and you have some other regional powers that you've got to share power with. And it means forms of consultation, forms of getting a buy-in from your allies, so that you're not just alone, but you're really a global community that is going towards, that's moving towards a system of cooperative internationalism rather than unipolar internationalism. On these other questions, I would say the issue of development versus democracy, of markets or neoliberal philosophy of economic development versus state-led philosophy of market development. These are all very important issues, but it seems to me too much of the discussion tends to be pitched at an ideological and an intellectual level, and not enough focuses on the fact that, be it a democracy or a quasi-democracy or even a non-electoral democracy like China, what's critical is how effective government is, how coherent and effective its policies are. And I would highlight 3 elements that come out of the lessons of the last 30 to 40 years. First, regardless of what form of polity you have, how democratic it is, you've got to avoid capture by vested interests. That is one of the characteristics of what people call a developmental state. Avoiding being captured by the people you're regulating or by influential persons or businesses in your country. That alone distinguish countries quite markedly. The countries that avoided capture have done much better than the countries that tend to be responding rather directly to specific private interests. Secondly, particularly in democracies, but I would say even in a place like China or the sort of non-democracies, in order to take a long-term orientation and to convince everyone of the benefits of a long-term orientation, they must be able to see some benefits in the short term. Now that's obvious in the case of electoral democracies, but it's true even in the case of non-electoral democracies. People must see some benefits in the short term in order to support you and to preserve your legitimacy, be it as a communist party or be it as an elected government. And I think investing in social foundations, which by the way is not very expensive compared to investing in infrastructure and the other public goods, investing in the social foundations and getting greater effectiveness of interventions in the social foundations does enthuse people, does get them on your side, both men and women, and it does lead to young people being willing to go with you even though they don't yet have high-paying jobs, but they know you've invested in their capabilities. So it seems to me that in general is neglected in the developing world, but it can also pay off politically. Investing in the social foundations while you're waiting for the economic results of your strategies to pay off, which sometimes takes longer. Thirdly, I would say, what you mentioned about Gracia Machel, and that first lecture she gave on, was it the girl child? But the criticality. To my mind, that is low-hanging fruit. In Africa, in India and South Asia, and some other parts of the world where girls are clearly not given the basic opportunities they need. If you look at number of years of schooling, even not learning adjusted, just number of years of schooling, there are large parts of Africa where if you're a girl from a poor family, let's say the lowest quintile of households by income, your average number of years of schooling is 1 year. This is what the data shows. If you're a girl from a median family, median income, your average number of schooling is about 5 or 6 years. And on a learning adjusted basis is well below that. But the solutions that have been tried in some places, which have succeeded in uplifting girls and keeping them in education, are not hugely complex. They involve toilets, they involve sanitary pads, they involve other fairly simple, the provision of very simple facilities and programs. And it can be done. So all that's left beyond that is social attitudes and political attitudes. But it just seems to me that if you look at what's a low-hanging fruit with a very significant payoff, is just lifting girls' education and getting them to complete primary school, go on to secondary school, and get more of them into the STEM disciplines. It can be done. And by the way, one of the things, I didn't mean to sort of talk about Singapore too much, but one of the things I'm very proud of in our education system is that not only do the girls do as well as the boys, all the way through, by the way, all the way through to polytechnic and university, but girls' representation in the STEM disciplines is very high. Very high. A bit less so in mechanical engineering, but very much so in chemistry, in physics, in the sciences. So, and there are many countries which show that it can be done. This is one area where it's not as if the developing world has to learn from the advanced world, because the advanced world, if you look at the US, has a very serious problem in public education. We can do this on our own by tackling very obvious problems and taking advantage of innovations that are already out there and implementing it and bringing it to scale. On the issue of global value chains, I would say the environment today is less conducive to countries getting onto global value chains for the reasons I mentioned. It's slower growing, there's some challenges in the advanced world and so on. But regionalization is an advantage. And I think within regionalization, and when I talk about regionalization, I'm not just talking about a regional value chain where you're serving the regional market. I'm talking about a regional supply chain that can make you even more competitive in the global market. But it does require some shifts in mindset. Because regionalization is not just about creating a market for ourselves by reducing barriers. It is a willingness to have a regional supply chain, which means I'm willing for another country in the region to specialize in something that I was doing, and I will specialize in something else. In other words, the willingness to allocate resources across member states of a regional arrangement based on what would be the most efficient according to our comparative advantage, so that you specialize in that, and I'm going to be part of a supply chain that leads on to final production in your country before you export to the world. And likewise, you will be part of a supply chain that leads to my cluster of activities being globally competitive. Regional arrangements allow us to build up more scale than is otherwise possible, but that scale only comes about if we are willing to think regionally about the supply chain and think not just in terms of markets, but think in terms of production. It's the supply chain that's the critical benefit of regionalization. Finally, taxes. President's question was a very thoughtful one, and frankly, not one with an easy answer. You make a very interesting point, that effective taxes, and you're defining it not just as an economist, but in the way an ordinary person would feel it. Effective taxes are quite high because they're not just paying some taxes, but they're having to spend the money on things that government should be doing. So it's quite a interesting concept you've introduced, but a very real one. It's not just an intellectual appeal, it's a very real one. In my opinion, improvements in tax administration that involve the taxes paid by better off people in society, including those who owed assets like land, those improvements win government a lot of credibility, and they actually win a lot of revenues. And that should be the first order of business. It's not about taxing the small guy more, but it's about improving tax administration so that people who are supposed to be paying their taxes and they're better off are actually paying their taxes and not getting away without paying their taxes. Second, in a broader concept of people paying for the future, you either pay taxes to the government in the hope that they invest in public goods, or you set aside some of your own savings for pensions, for housing, for other things. It seems to me that helping people save more also achieves some of the public good benefits that we are looking for, because people's savings, pooled and collectively organized, are also a source of funding for public goods. Helping people save more doesn't lead to them thinking they're paying a higher tax, because it's their money, it's still in their accounts. It's my defined contribution account in the pension scheme, but it can be used to fund national infrastructure, but it's my account. And that sense of ownership that comes through spurring national savings seems to me to be also an opportunity. And final point, although the question wasn't asked, since you asked about tax, I should mention that we should be concerned in the developing world and in Africa about some of the discussions taking place on corporate taxation globally. The good part of that discussion was avoiding tax profits shifting from one location to another in order to take advantage of tax loopholes and the like. That's a very good part of the discussion, and it's called the BEPS process, base erosion profit shifting, somewhat technical label, that's what the OECD calls it. And that has been a multilateral achievement in the last several years. The global community working collectively
to exercise surveillance and scrutiny of each other's tax systems and to scrutinize global companies so they can't shift profits that had been generated in one place to another location just to benefit from lower taxes or zero taxes. But the more unfortunate direction of recent discussions has been one that is shifting the whole basis of corporate taxation away from where profits are being generated through value-creating activities towards where companies are selling their products and services. In other words, shifting from where you're producing to the markets. And that, frankly, favors large, rich countries. It favors large, rich countries. And I worry about what it will imply for developing countries that will often need to use tax incentives to persuade a company to invest seriously in my own country, to create jobs, to invest in skills, and to be as efficient and competitive as possible. It didn't come about in Malaysia because it was Malaysia. It came about because of tax incentives. In fact, 0% tax for a period of time and very low taxes committed. And Malaysia took off in manufacturing. So did Singapore in an earlier stage. So have several countries. So the ability of developing countries to use tax incentives for the right reasons, not to get someone to shift profits to our countries, but to generate value add, that ability can be eroded by this latest direction in global corporate tax discussions.
Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, this has been a very, very robust conversation, presentation that has taken, actually we've spent about 2.5 hours, but it's gone by so quickly. You've been a wonderful audience, so first of all, I'd like for you to give yourselves a wonderful round of applause. Great questions. But the bigger thanks go to our eminent speaker, His Excellency Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, Singapore's Senior Minister and Coordinating Minister for Social Policies. Please, once again, give him a really, really warm African Development Bank applause. Thank you for taking the time to come out here at the bank, more importantly to Ivory Coast, and coming with a very large delegation all the way from Singapore. So again, could we give the delegation, again, a warm round of applause. Thank you very much. To the management and staff of the Africa Development Institute, and also to the ECVP, and the acting chief economist, as well as the director of the ADI, we'd like to say thank you very much. A lot of work goes into these events, and you guys have done a superb job. Please give the team a wonderful round of applause. We are going to end in just a few moments, but I just have a few housekeeping issues here. There will be a VIP lunch with the ambassadors and the delegation from Singapore and the bank's management up on the 13th floor immediately following this event. There are also packed lunches for the guests and students, as well as a cocktail outside in the auditorium as we exit. There will also be lunch packs for the bank staff. So please avail yourself of this hospitality as you exit. As we bring this time to a close, I do recognize that there was going to be an opportunity for media questions. We're going to try and work out the details and the logistics on that so that we can avail ourselves of that opportunity. And for those members of the press who are here, just meet with me immediately following and we'll work out the details on that. The President and the delegation from Singapore will exit the platform first, going out through the exit door over here, followed by members of the diplomatic corps, the executive directors of the bank, the senior members of management, and the students. And finally,